Okay.
I'm going to just
I'm going to speak first about how I came to this topic, and then I'm going to highlight some of the topics and women in my book, and you can follow. I'm not going to talk about all these women, but you can follow with what passed out, and then I'll conclude with a few general comments on women's history. I taught women's history at Hofstra for 25 years. I never had a course in women's history. It wasn't offered when I was in college or in graduate school. But in the last, 40 years or so, it's become very popular with specialized courses in women's history as well. On the first day of my women's history class, I would always hand out a quiz. Good to get people's attention. Name 10 women important in American history and explain what they did, why they were important. I think I had one student who got to 10, and she went to Europe to bring in a few women. I think the average was about 3, which usually was Betsy Ross, who didn't make the first American flag, Martha Washington, and their mother. I used to laugh at their mother, but our mothers are important. I mean, they are important influences, so not so outrageous a choice. You might try that. I put a cutoff date for my students. I didn't want all the celebrities, the television, it had to be more history. Pick a date when you stop your formal education or something, I don't know. Try it sometime. And it doesn't have to be, I wasn't asking for Long Island women at that point. You don't need to either. But the next question I would ask when they finished is, can you name 10 men important in American history? And of course, that's no problem. You got all the presidents, the generals, et cetera, et cetera. The history that we've learned in school, by and large, has been his story. So her story, or her story, is the title I sometimes use. I sometimes was asked, how long did it take you to write this book? This book, there it is. And there are 2 answers to that. It was a year from when I signed the contract to when I handed the final material in, but in another sense, it was 30 years, because I had been working on women for a long time. Once upon a time, long time ago, I was teaching 2 graduate courses in a summer session, and one was on women's history and one was on Long Island history. And there was one student who happened to be in both classes. And one day, Loretta raised her hand and said, "Why are there no women in our Long Island history textbook?" And I was embarrassed, because that was a question I should have asked. But I went back after and looked in the book that we were using at that point for Long Island history. I went through it. There were a few women. There was Queen Elizabeth I. There was Anne Hutchinson, and neither of them ever set foot on Long Island. And there were witches, because we had some witch trials. And that's always a sexy topic, as it were. That was it. For a documentary history written in the 1970s, but 2 male professors who I think were living back in the 19th century. So that was when I decided, I left out one. Harriet Martineau was quoted. Martineau, who was a British traveler, and her account of Rockaway was in the book. But that was it. And I think those professors were living back in they were men, 19th century? Okay. So I started looking for women in Long Island history, and the place I went first was this book. You can see the cover of mine is well worn. Book, Notable American Women. Standard reference work in the field, or was at the time. There's a new one. Well, no. This was the first volume published, and I went through that to look for women who had some connection with Long Island. And it was started, this was published because, or the standard reference work in the field, which is the Dictionary of American Biography, or was the Dictionary of American Biography, 20 volumes like this on the library shelf. Less than 0.5% of the entries are women. 0.5%. We now have 5 volumes of notable American women, and the pages are pretty dense. You can see this happens to be Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, at a part of her entry. Each are about 2 inches thick, and there are more than 3,600 pages in the 5 volumes, nearly 2,300 women. These are nationally famous women, and you have a sheet on nationally notable women I gave you on that have some connection with Long Island. I located more than 150 women with connection, about 50 who lived or worked on Long Island during their years of accomplishment, which was the criteria I tried to use. Not just that you simply had been born here or happened to die here. And I included, I wrote an article at that point in the Long Island Forum, publication no longer being published, but 2-part article, and I included in that women in Brooklyn and Queens, as well as Nassau and Suffolk, and it would have been a much shorter article if I hadn't. For this book, I limited to Nassau and Suffolk County. The cover that the editor chose here, Irene Castle, was there's some information about her there on the screen. You may have seen on your television the story of the film, the story of Vernon and Irene Castle with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It comes up quite often on the screen, a 1939 film. And so that was my first venture, if you will, into the topic. And then, whoops, why didn't that advance? I did something wrong. And now I have to get out of this. There we go. Okay. Whoops. Had a conference at Hofstra. In 1996, I was director of the Long Island Studies Institute, and this is the conference volume we published on Long Island women, 31 papers from the conference, and I'm sure it's probably in, I was meant to check, but I suspect it's in the Sayville Library as this book is, I hope. I drew on some of the articles in this book for my book as well. And let's see, I was continuing to teach women's history, so that helped as well. And let's see, for this book I also included regionally famous women and provided some context of Long Island history. There are many references in the notes if you want to explore further. And more than 200 women who are mentioned in the book. And I'll turn now to focus on some of them and the topics, and following the sequence of articles, and I hope most of those I'm mentioning are in the handout that you have. And the first Long Islanders, of course, were the Native American Indians. And I love this picture. Can we dim the lights a little bit? I wanted to include this in the book. I don't know what happened. She was away. I didn't get permission to include it until it was too late. But Chi Hale, a reminder that we still have Indians on Long Island, or indigenous people, whatever term you want to use. There are 2 reservations, the Shinnecock in Southampton and the Mcclintock in Mastic Beach. And at the powwow, here she is, the same woman years later, and I happened to have met her a number of times, knew her not well, but she was a wonderful woman. Back in the 1600s, in the Algonquin culture, in the Shinnecock and Algonquin is a general term that covers the language spoken here on Long Island by the Native American Indians. And in that culture, it was the women who cultivated and to some extent controlled the land. And the English often did not identify women in the records that have come down to us. And that reflected the English views that women couldn't own land, or certainly not married women. The land was under their husbands. But John Strong, in an article in the Long Island Women book, has identified some, what is the number? 40 Long Island transactions, including Algonquin women in the colonial period. So they were there, and they were important. Their names appear on the records, but they've been ignored. Many colonial records have only the names of men among, and even when they're talking about the English or the Dutch settlers on Long Island. And for example, if you could have a trading post, you could have a lumbering camp, you could have a fishing village with only men. But when you have a settlement with women, that signified permanence. People were going to stay. And Long Island was settled by families. But again, in the records, we often do not have their names. So if you read about the Bethpage Purchase, for example, you will learn about Thomas Powell, who purchased Bethpage. Maybe they will mention Mrs. Thomas Powell. Try to find out what her given name was. Well, it took a while, but I found he had 2 wives. The first one died, not uncommon. And Abigail and Elizabeth were the ones who bore him 15 children total. And certainly Thomas didn't have all those children by himself, nor did he take responsibilities for rearing them. But if you multiply those, the number of years that those women spent pregnant and raising those children, that's what contributed to the population growth in this country, and on Long Island and in this country. There was a feature story in Newsday a number of years ago for Women's History Month, in days when they gave it more attention, or maybe people gave it more attention because we didn't get that much this year, certainly on women's. Well, they did a couple feature articles, though. I will say that. But in terms of events, there just haven't been that many that have been scheduled. But let me quote from the Newsday article. They mentioned some famous names. Susan B. Anthony, for example. And the article here, quoting, after mentioning every one of those famous women whose names are recorded, but not always remembered, there are countless other women whose history was made not behind the podium, but across the kitchen table. Not women who didn't build nations, but who nurtured families, who aspired not to greatness, but to grace. Women whose lives centered not around domestic policy, but domestic work, end of quote. And I tried in my subtitle to indicate everyday lives and tried to touch on that in the book, besides the notable women, which is also in the title, the eminent ladies in the subtitle. And here is one of those everyday lives. A diary, a published diary of a Long Island woman from colonial times. Mary Cooper lived in Oyster Bay on Cove Neck, near where Theodore Roosevelt would later build his home, Sagamore Hill. And the Oyster Bay Historical Society still has copies of this book if anyone wants to read it, or it may be in your library. And her diary, covering the years from 1768 to 1776, still survives. And published, as you can see. She was in her late 50s and 60s at the time this diary covers. Her surviving daughter had separated from her husband and was living with her parents in the house. And that house survives but looks much different now. And she had help also from an enslaved woman who they owned property. I get tired just reading about how Mary spent her time and work. And I quote, this is from a summary I gave in my book. Visits from relatives, friends, tradesmen, and even strangers are frequent, and Mary had to feed them. Some even stayed overnight. It was rare when she could write, "Nobody here, I am alone." More often, she was sore distressed, as she said. One January evening, she wrote, "Oh, I am tired almost to death waiting on visitors. My feet ache as if the bones was laid bare. Not one day's rest have I had this week. I have no time to take care of my clothes or even to think my own thoughts." She frequently wrote that she was unwell, but more often that she was exhausted. "I am tired almost to death, dirty and distressed." Mary's days were full, the normal cooking, baking, ironing, cleaning, and washing, but also combing wool, preparing flax, spinning, sewing, making candles, salting beef, making sausage, preserving quinces, boiling soap, gathering berries, drying apples, cherries, and pears, and that's not all of her work. That's just a small sample. And in the years prior to the Revolution, it was the women who made the boycotts against the British goods effective because they found substitutes for tea and wove homespun rather than buy British cloth. And quoting again from my book, from a newspaper, a Boston newspaper in 1769. Three young ladies at Huntington on Long Island, namely Ermina, Letitia, and Sabrina, having met together, agreed to try their dexterity at the spinning wheel. Accordingly, the next morning, they sit themselves down and, like the virtuous woman, put their hands to the spindle and held the distaff. At evening, they had 26 skeins of good linen yarn, each skein containing 4 ounces, all of which were the effects of that day's work only. End of quote. The newspaper editor urged Boston women to follow the example of these Long Island women. There were daughters of liberty as well as sons of liberty, and during the war, some women played active parts. Did I go too far? Yes. Let me go back. Can I go back? Yes. Well, I guess not. You may have heard of Anna Strong of the Copper Spy Ring, who supposedly signaled when it was safe for the men coming across Long Island Sound to land, which cove they should land in, but she put a petticoats and handkerchiefs on her line, supposedly, to signal which stage. That's all folklore, but it's a good story. And if you watched the AMC, I guess, series Turn a few years ago, they took lots of liberties with the historical record in that whole series, including on Anna Strong. Anyway, there are various instances of domestic resistance during the Revolution, of women who, in their homes, resisted the demands of the British soldiers. And one of the most best known was in East Hampton, when an incident, a woman was making pudding, whether it was corn pudding or Indian pudding or plum pudding, who knows, but the British soldiers smelled it and came up and demanded that she give them some. And here is what happened according to a poem written in the 19th century, The Ballad of Pudding Hill, Fanny Elkins. "Oh, no, you're not," she made reply, then seized the boiling pot, ran with it through the open door and threw it, blazing hot. Pudding and all adorned the hill and left it in the sand, and amid the curses loud and deep of all the hungry band. The place and tale are widely known, fresh is the legend still, and all East Hampton villagers are proud of Pudding Hill. Now, I don't know whether it really happened or not, but there is a Pudding Hill Street in East Hampton, so maybe it did. Who knows? Those instances of domestic resistance may not have been the norm, although I include a number in my book. Long Island was occupied by the British throughout the war, or at least after the Battle of Long Island in Brooklyn in August 1776. All women literally kept the home fires burning when husbands and sons were away. And they kept the farms going. But most women's lives well into the 20th century centered on domestic sphere, family and children. Religion and good works were acceptable activities as well. And women's writings and diaries and letters, journals give added meaning to the objects they used, the material culture they created, which you see here. Samplers were ubiquitous in a way that young girls demonstrated that they knew the alphabet and that they could sew, embroider, which was an important skill to have at the time when you could not have ready-made clothing, sewing machines didn't exist and such. So we have samplers, quilts, other needlework, and women often did theorem paintings, which is on velvet here. Nina Mount is known as the first professional woman artist on Long Island, from the famous Mount family. And the current exhibit at the Long Island Museum in Stony Brook on women artists, in the small gallery, have, I think it's 5 or 6 of her paintings, more than they have shown, I think, ever at one time. Historic house museums, exhibitions, and places like Old Bethpage Village Restoration can bring to life the domestic sphere of earlier years. And think about spinning and weaving. And do you know how you can tell whether cloth was woven by a man or a woman? There's a what is it? A rhythm is the word I'm looking for. There's a rhythm in weaving, throwing the shuttle back and forth, back and forth. Most professional weavers were men, and many of the bedspreads, bedcloths you see were woven by men. And men, the professional weavers could sit for hours weaving. If someone is an expert weaver and they look closely at cloth, you can tell when the weaver interrupted their throwing the shuttle. Women had to take care of the kids, make the meals, many more interruptions. And that's how one tells, if one is skilled enough, I'm not, but I'm told, whether cloth was woven by a man or a woman. And if you go to a place like Old Bethpage and they have reproductions of cast iron pants, try lifting those, or the flat irons. They're very heavy. That gives you some idea also of some of what was involved, even just literally keeping the fire burning on the hearth. There was lots that involved in that. Well, women assisted husbands in running taverns, took over running them after husbands died. We have President Washington's journal of his 1790 tour of Long Island, and he writes about stopping at Widow Platt's tavern. When her husbands died, the widow took over. A couple of the places he stopped were run by widows. One was Clinch Manor, or Widow Blydenburg. He's not very effusive about the meals he got at those places, but that was his way. And very widespread in the whoops! Oh, don't do that! Don't do that. In the 19th century was this. There we go. Boarding houses. Women could essentially stay in the domestic sphere and bring money into the family by running a boarding house, providing bed and board for paying customers. And as you see, this village house in Orient is interpreted as a boarding house these days. And let's see, they had many summer visitors out there. Rosanna and her daughter-in-law, Nancy Vale, ran this in Orient, or Oyster Ponds as it was then known. Or women could be seamstresses working out of their homes, or hired help, or servants working in homes of others. Teaching school was a popular occupation for women, partly because they could be paid only half as much as men, so they were cheaper. And for women, it was an extension of the domestic sphere of teaching children in the home. I have a chapter on Long Island's 5 first ladies, and Anna Sims lived with her grandparents on the North Fork after her mother died, and she became the wife of William Henry Harrison, who was elected president in 1844. Something's wrong there with the date, because, okay, he dies in 41. Anna had 10 children, largest number of any first lady. Unfortunately, child mortality was high in the 19th century. Her children, all but one, died before she did, many of them as adults. So that was a bit unusual. She's the only first lady whose grandson became president, Benjamin Harrison. William Harrison's claim to fame is that he had the shortest term of office in history, 1 month, and he had the longest inaugural speech. I think it was 2 hours. Not unconnected. They were outside. It was raining. He caught, some accounts say, pneumonia. They dispute exactly what it was, but at any rate, he was succeeded by, you may have remembered that Tippecanoe and Tyler II election was William Henry Harrison and John Tyler II. And Tyler was married, but his wife died while he was president. And, well, even before she died, he was flirting with the lovely Julia Gardner from Long Island. and finally married her. And she wasn't First Lady for too long, but she was a stunning First Lady. And as you can see here, connections to Sagticos Manor also. In this. And of course, Dewey Gardner from Gardner's Island, East Hampton, 30 years younger than John, who she married, only 9 months as First Lady. I wrote an article which I entitled Mrs. Tippecanoe and Mrs. Tyler too, TWO, for these two First Ladies. John Tyler had 15 children, but that was between the two wives. Theodore Roosevelt's wife, Edith, had the longest connection with Long Island, and half of my chapter on First Ladies is devoted to Edith. She had her portrait, which you see here, painted by her favorite artist, a woman artist, is Celia Beau. It was supposed to be of Edith only, but the artist writes that the younger daughter, Ethel, literally jumped into the picture, and so she added her and painted her in the picture. You don't see this very often, as it indicates it's in a private collection in the family. Edith handled family finances. She managed the White House in Sagamore Hill, supervised the addition of the North Room at Sagamore Hill, and the West Wing in the White House. She had to deal with TR's proclivity for inviting guests. There is 1 week in 1913, this is after he was president, after he ran in 1912, 1 week when they had 175 meals for family and guests at Sagamore Hill. That's in the census, though. If you go to the manuscript census, it lists Edith's occupation as nun or housework, which was the term used at the time for housewives or homemakers, as we might say. Either of those designations ignores her role in managing the estate, managing finances and such. And when she died in 1948, outlived her husband by 28 years, actually. Her daughter, Ethel, who you saw in the picture, was by her side. And on the death certificate where it asked for occupation, Ethel reported her mother's occupation was lady. And I did an article, I called her the Lady of Sagamore Hill, which seemed appropriate. Eleanor Roosevelt and Jackie Kennedy are the other two First Ladies with Long Island connections, both of which were relatively short in childhood. But Eleanor had her father had a home in East Meadow, Westbury, and when she was quite small, and some school children in the East Meadow School District discovered this, and they petitioned the Hempstead Landmark Commission to put up a historic marker near the house. So I thought that was a nice touch there. Let's see. And we have authors. This is another chapter. And Newsday had a feature article a couple weeks ago on this woman, Frances Hodgson Burnett. You may know The Little Princess or The Secret Garden, children's classic. She was a very prolific author, not only children's books, but that's how they're remembered today. She wrote The Secret Garden when she moved to Plandome in the Manhasset area. She had shorter stays in Long Beach and East Hampton. She's buried in the Roslyn Cemetery on Northern Boulevard, where there's a statue, life-size statue to her son Lionel, who died in England when he was only 16 years old. Women in the arts is the largest single category of women in my book. or at least for nationally notable women. Two sculptors at the turn of the century, turn of the last century, worked in Nassau County. And here, one I had never heard of, Sally James Farnham, who was lived in Great Neck, and the better known Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was a sculptor and art patron. She founded the Whitney Museum in New York City, and she had a studio on Long Island, which you see here, and which still survives. I've been in it, as a matter of fact. And she did large sculptures. This is Buffalo Bill Cody out in Wyoming, as you indicated here. William Merritt Chase's Shinnecock School enrolled many women, taught them art, mostly women students. And there have been quite a few painters on the East End in the 20th and 21st century. Here, Lee Krasner, and she and Elaine Kooning had been overshadowed for many years by their husbands, Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. The Long Island Museum in Stony Brook currently has an exhibit on women artists, and much of it is, I mentioned they have Nina Mound's paintings, but they also have Lee Krasner's and other 20th century artists in that exhibit, which is worth seeing. Women have been very active in churches, which in the 19th century were the center of community life and women's main activity outside the home. Ladies' aid societies, missionary societies, sewing circles were often rooted in churches, and women used their domestic skills to raise money for religious and other benevolent causes by having fairs and publishing cookbooks. Some still do, I think, those activities. Here, Ella Smith of Smithtown, and she created women's societies, fundraising committees in the Smithtown Presbyterian Church for more than 25 years. And I thought it was a fitting testimony to her, someone's elegy to her, that could apply to many other women as well. And I quote here, "No one can measure the good she has done, not alone in her own home village, but reaching far out to places we little know of." End of quote. And that good she has done included civic activities outside the home, firehouse project. She was on the Smithtown Library Board, worked for a local lecture series. She aided fresh air children and European famine victims, and that's probably only a few. And there's an article on her in the Long Island Women book. And Red Cross was, if you multiply Ella Smith by countless others and you add organizations such as the Red Cross, Ladies Village Improvement Societies, and there was one in Sayville, and there's an article in the book on the Sayville Ladies Village. Sayville Village Improvement Society. It was originally only women, but they didn't have it in their name, they tell me. So the good they have done in terms of contributing to the community infrastructure, beautification projects, one thing or another, tree planting, initiating public libraries. Many started with women, establishing parks and beachfront. The list goes on and on. And those activities have been important in creating the essential cultural and civic infrastructure in communities. And Catholic nuns have long worked unheralded in teaching, social work, and nursing, first professions created by women. And the Sisters of the Franciscan Missionaries of Mary opened a summer camp for children, poor children, in 1921 that evolved into a sanatorium for children. and later into today's St. Francis Hospital in Roslyn, which is one of the leading cardiac hospitals in the country. Nuns have staffed parochial schools. The Sisters of St. Joseph ran an academy for girls in Brentwood for more than 150 years, and now St. Joseph's College in Patchogue and Brooklyn. Sisters of St. Dominic established their mother house, Rosemary Hall, on an 87-acre farm they received in North Amityville in 1867. And they now have a nursing home and assisted living on that property. I discovered it when they invited me to speak a couple of weeks ago there. They also started Malloy Catholic College for Women in Rockville Center, and we have a student here from Malloy who is now co-educational Malloy College. And those are just a few examples of the activities of the Catholic religious sisters that could be mentioned. I think they have not deserved the credit they should get, and I admire what they have done. I say that, I don't happen to be Catholic, but I admire the work that they have done. One of the more notable women, Cornelia Clinch Stewart, the wife of Alexander T. Stewart, who started Garden City as a model community. He died before all his plans could be realized. And I submit that it was Cornelia who really made Garden City a special community by persuasive philanthropy. I love that term. She convinced, one might say bribed, the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese to move the seat of the diocese from Brooklyn, which was then the third largest city in the United States, to Garden City that had a couple hundred people, because she promised him a cathedral, 2 schools, a bishop's residence, and did I leave out something? A deanery, yes. And she delivered on all that, and the seat of the Episcopal Diocese is still in Garden City, thanks to Cornelia. And that made Garden City a special place, I think, certainly in its early years, and very different from others. Less well known is this woman, unusual entrepreneur, not well known outside the community of Bellrose, which she developed. She bought 77 acres in 1907, just east of the Queens border, and designed houses for families of differing income levels. She laid out the streets, landscaped with flower beds, and built a railroad station. Long Island is the cradle of aviation, and my favorite aviator is Eleanor Smith, who grew up in Freeport, there were many pioneering women pilots. I have a chapter on them, and I have a whole talk on them, but Eleanor was at 16, was the youngest woman licensed to fly, and at the age of 16, she flew under all 4 East River bridges, something that has never been duplicated to this day. She was more proud of the altitude and speed and endurance records that she set. And all her life, she was involved with aviation. She also raised a family. I had the pleasure of hearing her speak at one point, so I'm particularly fond of her. If you go to the Cradle of Aviation, you'll see more on her and other women as well. Alva Smith Vanderbilt Belmont, a wealthy socialite who had several Long Island homes, married to the senior William K. Vanderbilt for 20 years, and lived some of that time at Idlehour in Oakdale. That was until recently Dowling College. And then she divorced and married Oliver Belmont. And you may have visited the Marble House in Newport. That was Alva's house. She had 2 homes on Long Island. This Disney-esque home that doesn't exist it's no longer standing. Less well known is the one in East Meadow, and I guess I didn't include the picture. But Alva got involved in suffrage and was an important contributing money to the suffrage cause. But my favorite suffragist is General Rosalie GardnerJones, and here you see her on the right. And when you voted in 2017, you should have received that sticker that they didn't identify her, but it's Rosalie. You can see it in those two slides, two pictures here. She gained her fame as a celebrity by hiking to Albany from New York City to Albany, 170 miles, walking all the way, snow, sleet, rain, mud, and then follows it up to present a petition to the governor, and follows it up with a walk from New York City to Washington, D.C. for Woodrow Wilson, and is involved in the famous 1913 suffrage parade there. The organizers put the pilgrims, they had pilgrim capes at that point, at the back of the parade. They were jealous of all the publicity they were getting. This is the Suffrage Tent at the Riverhead Fair. This was very popular because they had free childcare. And it is said that one family brought their child, and the husband thought the wife was picking him up, and vice versa, and the child spent overnight with and converted the husband to suffrage because they did such a good job. And this, Edith Kearns wagon, Edna Buckman Kearns, and last year there was a historic plaque erected on the Long Beach Boardwalk for her activities in suffrage. So let's see what's next. We have in civic women and these Pratt women. At the final meeting of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the president, Carrie Chapman Catt, recommended and was the founding of the League of Women Voters. And the first Nassau County League began with a meeting at the Killingworth home of Helen Pratt, who was the first president of the League. You see here her on the right, and that's her home is the Russian embassy. It's been in the news recently. Yes. And there's a historic marker for the suffrage leaders outside that on the road there. And Ruth Baker Pratt, her sister-in-law, was Helen was a founder of the Lincoln Settlement House in Glen Cove and hosted a league convention at Killingworth. She died in her mid-50s, cut short her involvement. Ruth Baker Pratt, a country house in the Pratt Oval in Glen Cove, and the first woman to serve on the New York Board of Aldermen from 1925 to 1929. First woman from New York State to serve in Congress from 1929 to 1933. She represented Manhattan. So her political base was in Manhattan, but her country home was here in Glen Cove. And they spent a good deal of time here as well. And she was on the Republican National Committee and various other activities. And you can visit, her home is now the mansion at Glen Cove. You can stay overnight there, and have meals and so on. I earlier mentioned the Roosevelt daughter, Ethel, who jumped into that portrait of her mother, and she chose to have her official portrait painted in her Red Cross uniform. The Roosevelts like to boast that all their sons served in the Great War. She was the one who first went to Europe to help in the war with her surgeon. Her husband was a doctor and served in the American military ambulance service over there before the United States got involved in the war. She only spent a few months there, but she left her infant child with the parents, and it was the beginning of her lifelong activities with the Red Cross, and her devotion to that, I think, signifies this. And also, let's see, she was named the Oyster Bay Citizen of the Year in 1962. The list of her local involvements included working successfully for low-income housing, then as now, not a popular cause. More than any other individual, she's responsible for saving Sagamore Hill for the public. Ethel is in 2 chapters in my book as a civic activist and as a preservationist. And Bertha Rose, who you see here presenting a certificate to her, is an important preservationist. She did the initial furnishing plans for Sagamore Hill, for Rock Hall in Lawrence, Raynham Hall in Oyster Bay, and the Joseph Floyd Manor House. Mattie Edwards Hewitt did not live on Long Island, but she worked here, took many vintage photographs of mansions and estates, and in my chapter on historians and preservationists. During World War II, many Long Island women served in non-traditional jobs in the airplane factories, and at its peak, women were 60% of the workforce at Republic and 30% at Grumman, a total of 8,000 women working at Grumman at the peak. And most of those women were on the production line. They were getting good salaries for that. And these recruitment posters, and they had free child care in those days because the government wanted to encourage them to work. Most of the women were not able to retain their jobs after the war. And the figures at Grumman are interesting. Only 213 women employed at Grumman in 1947, and 210 were in clerical positions. So they had gone home, back to the house, married, baby boom, and all that. We have not yet achieved equality in wages. Women's pay is about 79% of men's, and a gender gap in every occupation and educational level. The most notable of the women scientists on Long Island, longest roots, Barbara Mcclintock, grew up in Brooklyn and educated at Cornell. She came to Cold Spring Harbor Lab in 1941 and remained there the rest of her long life and was working throughout. Her research focused on transposable genetic elements, popularly known as jumping genes in corn, which is why I chose this picture for her there's an article in the Long Island Women book. And she lived in Cold Spring Harbor for more than 50 years, across from the lab, or in her later years on the grounds. There's one of the lab buildings that is named for her these days. Some of you may remember Marilyn Goldstein, who wrote a 516 column for the Newsday, and she was the keynote speaker at our women's conference. And I summarized her comments in my book, and I'll read this. Long Island was in the 1970s a veritable hotbed of feminism. She cited many examples of feminist activities. Florence Howe started the feminist press at SUNY at Old Westbury. Hannah Komanoff was elected supervisor in Long Beach, and Karen Burstein was elected to the New York State Senate in 1972. All of those were firsts. Among the bills Burstein supported were ones permitting girls to deliver newspapers, prohibiting charging for women's toilets when men's were free, and some of you remember those terrible old days. If you didn't have a dime, you were sunk. Eileen Brennan in Hicksville fought to become the first woman police officer in Nassau County, and Jenny Leeds of Great Neck won the right to play Little League baseball. Right. Farmingdale teachers successfully challenged a district requirement that they leave teaching when 4 months pregnant, and such policies were very common in other school districts, and and other occupations as well. The Nassau County of Now, the National Organization of Women, was the third largest chapter in the country in the mid-1970s, more than 500 members. I didn't attempt to go to the present time, bring the story up to date. It's hard to get perspective. I was already thousands of words over what I had been assigned, and so I don't go much beyond 1980, though I touched on some of it. And I forgot to say the Dictionary of American Biography, Notable American Women, and many of the biographical dictionaries, one of the criteria is that the women have to be dead. The people have to be dead. And by and large, I followed that. It gives us more perspective on, rather than the contemporary celebrities. But I did include a few women still alive. And the epilogue touches on some themes, but most of you have lived through them, and looking back on your own lives can remember. So what did I leave out? An index, for one thing, because I didn't read the directions carefully. If anybody buys a book from me, it has the portable index, as it were. I did do my own index. I've been keeping a file on women that I left out or should be added, and one of the things that I did was write an article last year. One of the areas was sports. There weren't a lot of women involved in sports pre-Title IX and all that, but I wrote an article last year for the journal I edit on Marion Hollins. Nobody has ever heard of her. Equestrian, but a superb golfer, won a lot of golf championships, and started a golf club for women in Glen Head. Marion Hollins, and women in the environment. And I did an article that was in the Long Island History Journal on women in the environment, and I'm almost finished. A few general comments on women's history. Whenever you're reading a history, you might ask yourself, what were the women doing? Because women's history has been making us rethink generalizations. For example, was Jacksonian democracy really better for women who made a decision to move west? Probably not the women. The period of and it might have meant drudgery for women, more drudgery for women, and leaving family and friends behind. Gloria Steinem once said, women have always been an equal part of the past. They just haven't been part of history. Women's history, as historian Gerda Lerner reminds us, is the history of the majority of humankind. Women are the majority of the population, though they've often been treated as a minority. And so the motto of Women's History Week or month, as it is now, write women back into history, and the pun is intended there, obviously. So I tried to do that in my books. I'm not trying to say that only women made history, but my topic tonight is women's history. Men are obviously important throughout our history. I wouldn't try to claim only women, that it's the whole story. But the history that many of us studied in school has been a white, male, Anglo-Saxon, predominantly Anglo-Saxon history. And so including women's history enables us to envision a more accurate, more complex, but far richer history of humankind. So whether famous or ordinary women, those with a national reputation, or community builders, or the thousands of anonymous, ordinary women who are part of Long Island history, it's a rich and glorious tradition. The good they have done, their contributions and accomplishments, their influence and power are the legacy of these our foremothers on Long Island and the nation. Not sure how many of the women on the cover you can identify. I didn't talk about all of them, but let's see. That's just about it. I'll just leave, there's the citation for the, if you want to hear my talk on women on the suffrage, it's on the Nassau County Historical Society website. So with that, I thank you for coming, and if you have questions or comments, it took a little bit over an hour, but it's not 9 o'clock yet.
No.
Yeah, I actually have two
More.
questions. The first is, I don't think you self-published this art, right? Because when you're saying you forgot the index, did you get a grant, or how did you go forward with this?
History Press published it.
Okay.
Which, what is more common are the Arcadia
Right, I know
imprints that are
was
mostly
yeah.
photo histories.
Mm-hmm.
History Press books are more text, they have
Right.
photographs. I didn't get it, no, I wrote it when I was retired, I
Okay.
get a pension.
Okay. Okay.
You don't have to put up any money for, other than if you have to pay for some photographs
Okay.
for History Press. What was the rest of your question?
Oh, the second question is
We talked about the index before,
Right.
so that was
the
my
second-
stupidity.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The second question is, since your book has come out, have people come forward to you and told you about other women that are historically important on Long Island?
Occasionally, not as often as I'd like.
Okay.
One of the nice things about this book is it's now on sale in Walgreens.
Oh, that's
I mean,
great.
it's at Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all those, but they've also got it in Walgreens. The problem I had when we were publishing these were subsidized publications from Hofstra. Marketing was a problem.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
Definitely.
that's the problem. Other questions or comments, or I'd love to know, I have gotten names of other suffragists. The people working for the centennial, a number of people have been working on suffrage, and some of the local leaders, there's more on those, yeah.
And
Yes,
actually,
Stephanie?
yes, they were just putting a plaque on the local, the Sayville Village Improvement Society as a,
Yeah, I'm
Their
having
office?
I'm having difficulty
so they're,
hearing, and so others may too.
they're putting a plaque on the local building for Ida Gillette.
Gillette?
As part of one of the local suffrages.
I know the Babylon historian Mary Castle put up 5 or 6 historic markers for suffragists because the Pomeroy Foundation upstate will pay for those roadside markers, which cost $1,000 or something like that. So they insist that, they have certain regulations, you gotta prove everything, primary sources and so on. So you've seen a lot more historic markers in the last few years because of that. I don't think I've heard of the one you're referring to.
It's not one of the roadside markers, they're putting it on the building.
Building
Gillette
itself.
House, yeah, where the
Yeah,
Village Improvement
that can
Society.
happen too, wherever. The more the better. Because we forget, and buildings are named for people, but who remembers the people that they're named for, men or women, for that matter. And presumably, I was never successful. Kate Mason Hofstra's money went to, she hadn't envisioned a college at all, but her husband's fortune, as with many widows, she wanted it for a charitable purpose or something like that. I forget the exact wording. She's in the book, though, I think. But Mason Hall at Hofstra does not have a plaque to Kate Mason Hofstra. I tried. That's what I can win. I mean, but there are buildings, there are streets, there are all kinds of places that we try to remember people, but then forget to tell anybody about what's behind the name. So thank you all for coming. Oh, if anyone, I think I did pass out to most of you, the list of nationally notable women, and if you want a flyer on the book, They're up here, so you can take, that has the full contents. Thank you all again, and I appreciate you coming.